certain conversations that are going to be filled with discomfort,
Yeah.
because relationship building is about being discomfort. I mean, being uncomfortable.
Yeah.
That's a key component to it, because if you have if it's always comfortable, there's probably a surface level dynamic, which means that, come a hard time or a frustrating moment, maybe one person has no one to lean to for support because everything is always so surface level. So therefore, we're not willing to show each other our wounds or show each other that, that we may be in pain, whatever that may look like, whether it's temporarily or long term. But all that can be like diverted by simply just talking to one another and being honest.
That's good. And even in that, you mentioned something that made me think about, ego,
Hmm.
or the protection of self ego. And then how do you define those shortcomings? Like, how do you define that? And to say, one, just knowing like, hey, this is a weak space for me, a weak area or shortcoming, and then once you've identified it, defining it, then addressing it. And how do you do so within your man group?
Yeah, well, ego is a pride thing, but you can't have effective community if you're full of pride, or pride is a still a major pillar in your life.
Mm,
And I think it kind of goes back to a space where we have to just acknowledge that nobody's life is perfect.
right,
Everybody's stuff stinks. Whether mine may be the same stench of yours, like we all have something.
right.
But you can't build effective community with egos in place, and because that ego is really that pillar behind that ego is really just pride. And that's just not a way for proper human connection. Is you're full of pride, because people who are full of pride, they lie, they cover things, they cover themselves, they really operate from a place of it's always got to be me protecting me, when that's
Yeah.
not what community is about. Community is about finding a place to be protected by other people. And
Mm,
you can't have that, and you can't embrace that or tap into that if you are always protecting yourself. Now, of course, that's comes from circumstances has taught us, or even circumstances, culture, and society has positioned us, or has positioned certain things in our minds that we always have to be the one that protects you. But that's not what community is about. Community says, hey, you know what? You don't have to protect you alone. I'll protect you as well. But you got to get rid of the ego thing. The ego just is never going to work in a space where you want to have community, but you have to want to have community first.
yeah. And that, one of the red flags that I've noticed with that is the deflection. It's always attempting to flip it back on the other person. Well, they did this, or what about that? And it's like, no, put that mirror back on yourself. Look at you. Let's be accountable. And going into one of our other points, as far as when we are removing ourselves, but also in that space of extending grace and being accountable. And that's part of it. Like when you remove the ego and just say, hey, it's me.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's really good.
And removing the ego is really just vulnerability in action.
Yes.
Like there's no way to grow in any kind of person-based dynamic or human-based dynamic if you're still not willing to be vulnerable.
Hmm.
It's just never going to get you anywhere.
Yeah, but I think the refusal to do that, or not being so apt to want to do that or inclined to do that, I think is sourced out of trauma, because you feel like, well, the last time I was vulnerable, the last time I was open, someone took those things and they weaponized it, and so now other people are paying for something that someone did previously. And it's like, at the same time, I understand that an individual might be hurt in that space, but you do need to address the trauma and the root of that and heal in that area, because if not, it's going to show up in other areas of your life and other relationships, and not just romantic, but just day-to-day connections and networking.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a principle where it's like I call it behaviors bleed. Like when
Mhm.
you start good behaviors, it bleeds into other areas. It's like going to bed early means you wake up the next day with more energy, which means you can be productive and all those kind of things like that. But then also when you have negative behaviors in place, they also bleed over as well. So that it's one of those things you got to recognize. You got to pick your poison. Which direction am I going to go? And most importantly, how committed am I to getting to that particular place? And that always goes back to an internal checks and balances system. Like how bad do you really want it? And
Mhm.
so often we've made how bad do you want it a monetary or a money thing or a success thing. But sometimes it really could be something as simple as peace. Or how bad do you want like quality community or quality friendships? But it's always, it just goes back to self. I think that in my perspective, people are just, they don't want things bad enough. Because when you
Can you
want,
unpack that a little bit more?
yeah, like acquiring things requires you to change. And people, to
Mhm.
me, are not committed to or willing to change. And often, especially in people of color, we wait for these major catastrophes for us to recognize like it's time for me to change. No, you got the hint a year ago,
Yeah.
but
Being like proactive,
instead of reactive,
reactive. Yeah.
and it's even like for those who may be like of the Christian faith, like often we will wait to live in a way where God has to quote unquote grab us by our throat, or any of the other crazy
Yeah, I
stuff.
know what you're saying,
Hey,
like some type
like
of miracle or something
yeah,
big and just dramatic. And it's
you
like,
know,
for example, like you have diabetes and he's been saying change your diet, change your diet. But then when the doctor's like, you might lose your foot, then you want everybody to fast and pray and you want a
no,
miracle.
I'm not doing that.
Yeah, I totally
That's a
understand.
preventative disease. I'm writing a paper
Yeah.
on those right now, preventative disease.
Um,
And it's kind of one of those things where, we have to really take a moment to say, what was preventable in my
mm,
life? Everything we can't control. There's some things that happen literally beyond our scope of control, but there comes a space or a moment where was this preventable? Or how long did I let this go unaddressed, unchecked, or undealt with, and it became a catastrophe in my life that it did not have to become? That's my fault.
yeah.
But
So
that
what
takes
are